Ready to get wild? Welcome to Hyper Creative, Whitewater Gallery's new video series on art, artists, and arts professionals. I'm your executive director, Alex. In this episode, I'll be taking you behind the scenes and on the scene for our newest exhibition entitled Wild Waysides, Queer Ecologies and the New Natural. I'll tell you, it couldn't be more fitting that we're starting out 2025 with an exhibition called Wild Waysides, and I'm going to tell you why. Over the years, a lot of people have asked us why Whitewater Gallery is called Whitewater Gallery. Well, back in 1974, when the founding members got together to name the gallery, they wanted the gallery to be a force of nature. And what better force of nature than the roiling, swirling turbulence of white water, also known as wild water. They wanted to disturb some peace. Not unlike the artists and curators for Wild Waysides. So let's take you inside. What is the Queer Up North Artist Residency?
The Queer Up North Artist Residency came about a couple years ago. I had done an artist residency on Toronto Island that Toronto Waxman had done. It was an intergenerational queer artist residency. And we saw a need to create one because there isn't a long-standing artist residency for queer people in Canada. And so I had talked to Pearl Van Geest, and we talked to the group from the Robin Rose Collective that I'm part of, and we thought, why don't we create something? So we went up north. Pearl and I had done the Broken Forest tour. It's a touring residency that happened in 2022. Thank you. So Pearl and I had attended the Broken Forest residency in 2022 with Dermot Wilson, and we went up north, and so we met some people up there, and we thought, why not bring a group of queer people up there? The thinking behind this is that often queer people will flock to urban centers. They'll leave rural places to find, their other queer people, and so they stay in urban centers. And so this was an opportunity to bring mostly people who live in urban centers into a rural setting and create a safe space for them to sort of explore the wilds. And the lodge itself, Northern Paradise Lodge up in Temagami, sort of became this gateway, right? It was the sort of last stop before the wilds, and it gave an opportunity for queer people to sort of go out and kind of commune with nature and go out and meditate, or they went out in small groups. Obviously the season was nice to go up in the summer, but I mean, this could also be a winter project. But they wanted to go out in small groups on hikes, or some people went out individually and just sort of, let these people sort of have a conversation with nature, and like what speaks to them, and how do they see themselves reflected in it, either just as an individual, but also as a queer person. So we just wanted to provide that opportunity for people, and then this idea of collaboration. So we were collaborating with nature. Some of the artists made work that involved the sun or the wind or water, but also collaborating with each other. So there was this sort of kinship that was fostered among the participants, but also a kinship with nature. So it's a great opportunity.
What was it like to take 16 2S LGBTQIA artists into the Northern Ontario wilderness?
It was really amazing because it was sort of a little bit like performance art, where you set up a scenario, you invite people, and then what happens. So we had great confidence in the people that we invited and the people that answered the call for submissions that we had. We wanted that mix up between people we knew and some people we didn't know as well, so there would be these interesting synergies and crossovers happening. And then Doug at Northern Paradise Lodge was very open to, like, okay, if you want to use the space, use it. If you want to, use some of the furs and the bones and the skulls that are around, like, incorporate that into your artwork. And then, Dermot Wilson, of course, helped us, we worked closely with him and the NRCC and setting up the place. So it was very much like, okay, here we are, here's the place, here's all these opportunity. So we went with Jerry Gooderham to the White Bear Forest in the island. We ourselves took people up to the fire tower and like, here's some trails, explore these. We went with Doug to the White Bear Forest, his tour where he talked about the trees and his special relationship to like the major, which is this great white pine. So we set these things up. We had access to canoes and kayaks and things like that. And so people went on those, and we had some cars. So we even did like, we went to the town, we went up to, what's the place where you got
Latchford.
Yeah, Latchford. So all these things people used, and it came together to create the pieces. So it was very exploratory and very open. And then Doug prepared dinner, so people didn't have to worry about dinner. All the rooms had like places they could like cook, so they could take care of their own breakfast and lunch. So the kind of food was kind of like out of the way, so people had all this time to explore. And because a lot of the spaces were communal, like working spaces, people would share materials, ideas. There was a lot of conversation. It was really special, I think.
It was nice. One of the things I really loved about it was that we knew many of the people that were coming, and I had worked with many of them from past projects. But then we also put out a call for submissions, so it was like some new people in the mix, and there was this sort of certainly an intergenerational element to it. There were young artists, there were some trans artists that were participating. And people came from different walks of life, and so it was really neat to sort of see people, maybe somebody was doing sound art, and somebody was doing something with water, somebody was doing cyanotypes, and like watching them sort of collaborate and have conversations, and sort of saw what came out of that. I thought that was really interesting.
Where did the title Wild Waysides, Queer Ecologies and the New Natural originate from?
The whole theme was queer ecology, queer ecologies, and we were sort of on the edge of the wild, as so-called. And so we've always wanted wild in the title, and queer ecologies, like, so there's more than one way of looking at it. And then James had found this book about Ontario flowers, and the subtitle was Wayside Flowers. So we thought that's perfect for the title for a number of reasons, like John Rubino and Francisco. They were collecting flowers literally by the wayside of the roadside. The place where we're staying, Northland Paradise Lodge, is a little bit on the wayside, a little bit on the edge, on the margins. Like, you face one way and it's the lake and the White Bear Forest. You face the other way and it's the town. So we really wanted to encapsulate the physical location where we were, the kind of theoretical or conceptual idea, but the waysides. And it was just kind of like a poetic, addition to the wild part. And then queer ecologies, the theme of the exhibition, and the title came from a book Kate Sandilands wrote, and she wrote an essay in it, and she edited. There's some really interesting essays about queer ecologies. And then the new natural part of it was a little bit cheeky, a little bit of a pronouncement, like here we are, the new natural, but also referring to issues of like environmental and justice, where like we need to look at our relationship with the natural world, like our being humans, in a different way. And also cheeky too, because of course we're well aware, and we were working with some Indigenous people, that this is the way that a lot of Indigenous peoples have looked at the relationship between the human and nature for, time immemorial. So it's kind of like encapsulates all those ideas.
What was the Queer Up North experience like for you?
It was a really amazing time to be with like 16 other people in this really rugged, beautiful place to just explore and experiment and make some work. And we were doing some readings along with the residency. So 2 of my 3 pieces deal with text that comes from the book that we were reading, which is
Yes, an important tome in the Queer Up North experience, for sure.
So, Temagami, my experience was that I just was struck firstly by how beautiful the the environment was, the nature was in Temagami. The skies, incredible. Every night we had a beautiful starry sky, beautiful moons. But my focus when I went to Temagami was really the flowers and plant life, and later the rocks. And my goal that I had set for myself was to research the plants, the local plants, the seasonal plants, and to incorporate them into my work. Some of which I've done over here in the form of studies. Later on, I looked to rocks and the environment, but always with the idea of how these plants and rocks are on the surface, the way that they might be the skin of the earth and analogous to our own skins, and how just as we need to care for ourselves, we need to care for this earth.
It was definitely really exciting. I was only there for 1 week, and I knew that, definitely my crutch is always going to be illustration, so my initial goal going up there was I was going to create an illustration piece that had some vignettes, and then back down south where I'm from, like in Guelph, we have a magazine that covers the region, so it's Kitchener-Waterloo, Stratford, Elora, Fergus, basically anything west of Toronto. It is a food and drink magazine, and in the back of that I have a comic every issue, which is actually on display here as well. And initially that was all I was planning on doing, is just going up there for the week, taking some reference material, and being able to create that piece. But what turned out of it was finding, these interesting rocks and being able to really work and develop into something a lot more interesting.
I was really excited when I was told about the Queer Up North Residency, not only because it's a 2S LGBTQ plus focused residency, but also because it would give me the time to be able to make this kind of work.
What is your artistic practice, and how is it affected by the Queer Up North Residency?
Well, basically, I'm someone who comes from the practice of drawing and pretty much, classical drawing and trying to be as naturalistic as possible. However, I hadn't really drawn for decades until very soon before the pandemic. I actually joined one of the other artists in the show, and I took a course just to sort of brush up on our skills. And when the pandemic hit shortly after, I just resolved to keep drawing. And so I as I got my skills back, and I was focused on more on themes of celebrity, like this T-shirt that I'm wearing is part of a series called Dead Celebrities, people who have died recently that moved me, like Sinead O'Connor, Amy Winehouse, David Bowie, people like that, Prince. But with this project, it's the first time I really tried to express something that was a little bit more of an abstract concept. And so working with the theme of the residency, I should say I've been a member of the Throbbing Rose Collective since it was founded. And in the first part of our existence, we were mainly focused on presenting other artists to the public. After the pandemic, of course, we all retreated, and when we came back together socially in 2022-23, we decided we wanted to focus more on curation and presentation of our own work, and so we expanded our membership a little bit to include more people who are doing visual art practice or related. And so with this series, I was trying to think about interspecies communication, and as someone who's very much a city person, trying to figure out how humans can connect more with nature, but doing that through a kind of queer lens of kind of sensuality and sort of love. So I was mostly, for some reason, interested in not the forest landscape where we were, but more the meadows, because in the cities, those types of meadows are often abandoned spaces, like on the side of a Don Valley Parkway or something, right? So we don't get to see full-grown plants that are considered weeds, and we were there in August, so they were all kind of at their peak and producing seeds and that stage. So I really connected with those types of plants like milkweed, Queen Anne's lace, etc. And I took a lot of photographs walking through, and then I sort of imagined a kind of a connection, a natural touching, a kind of a sensual, sensory connection with different plant specimens that were quite common up there, and so that's what produces series of work.
I would say that I'm actually more photo-based than textile, but I seem to be heading towards a more textile direction. It seems like, although I use ephemera and photographs, usually from my family archive, I've just found that fiber arts is really speaking to me right now.
So I like to think that I work in installation. I work mostly on things that are performance-based. I do sometimes do drawing, painting, and I like to culminate that all in virtual reality film, which I call tactile film. So often it's performance-based. I'm kind of the center of whatever it is, whatever topic it is that I'm exploring. I've made 2 full films at this point, and the second one, Subsumed, is in this show.
The thing that was really excited for me is I have a background in architecture and I work as an illustrator. I've done work for Second Cup, Nordstrom, and so in the past 20 years I haven't really worked on my fine art practice. So it was neat getting invited to Queer Up North and working on that and finding these amazing core samples. So this piece is a beautiful hybrid of working as an adapt reuse piece, but working within, adding some illustration and stuff that I'm really used to. So the piece is all about conversation and the idea, the interlocking, web of tiles, and the conversations that are happening, between the 2 animals, and just the idea of like the voids that can actually happen, and relationships and life, and the idea of like pulling this core out of the ground and just the hole that it creates, and in a relationship it ends, and like what is that hole that created as well. So that was really what I was going for.
My work is really about me and my experiences, my health experiences, and this work that's here up on the wall is part of the health series, and it's really a chronicle of some of my health journeys. And rather than seeing my health issues as something negative, I've tried to see it as part of my own life and part of my own growth and healing. And part of that I see as being connected to nature and the role of nature in my healing and my life. And so I've also looked to healing environments, healing plants, flowers, and all nature of healing elements. And so this work is really about, it's also about nature and the power of nature and how we all belong and are part of the natural world.
Well, I had, when I went with Broken Forest and Dermot and Cesar and Terre Chartrand up for the tour in 2022, I had this ink that was, it's a long process. I had this ink that friends of mine made from Guelph, from walnut trees. So I thought that's kind of interesting to I want to focus on forests and trees, use this ink made from this tree in one place and think about using another place. And then I had some, bamboo brushes, but I also had a brush that from Beam Paints, they're handmade brushes. And so then I would the place where I was working was, along with James, they had this view of a cedar grove, and I was drawing them with the ink, and I thought, well, let's apply them directly to the trees. And so I had people put their hands on the trees or hug the trees or whatever, and Jean-Marc Raymond and Terre Chartrand worked with me, and we traced the dipping the brushes in the ink and traced people's contours around where they were connecting with the trees. So I did the same thing up in Temagami, and then with those trees, I had some clay, and so I made imprints of the tree, the bark, and so I had those imprints. And so I didn't really know where I was going to go from there, but I had been working with mirrored things for a long time, and extrusions, drips, and the idea of excess, just that seeps out, the whole idea that we're discrete in certain ways, but in other ways we're not. Our skin's permeable, we're as beings permeable to other beings, and so all those ideas came together. Anyway, so I had those imprints of the trees, so I used the clay and made a dam around them to make a mold. So I poured plaster in, so then I had that positive, and then I used clay and made another negative, and then those are the things that are mirrored. And then I, and then there's those interesting patterns. So I love using color. So I use watercolor mostly, again, being paints. She makes this really interesting paint that has mica in it. So it has that shine and all natural, made naturally on Manitoulin Island. Because for me, it was really important to, as much as possible, use materials that were as natural as could be. And then it was just like developed from there. It was very it was a great way to work, keeping with the philosophy that we had at Queer Ecologies, where kind of one thing leads to another thing, didn't really have a set idea in mind, and then just was almost kind of speaks to you like, oh, try this. And then I had collected this red pine bark when I was on one of the tours with Doug and maybe Jerry, with the encouragement of Christian Bernard Singer, who harvests things to put in his work. He's like, yeah, go ahead. If you're, I felt a little, anyway, we had a big discussion about taking things. And so I incorporated that into the pieces. And then, and because it was sort of new, I didn't really even know what I was going to title it. And so James, when we were up here, hanging the show, was like, help me think of a title. And he came up with Pollinators and Other Sweet Things, which is really beautiful, I think, because they can look like organs, they can look like pollinators, bees, or they can look like creatures or body parts or different things. So that's all the intertwinement.
So first and foremost, I'm a painter. I've been painting now for 20 years, and I use maps in my work. Maps for me, it's an interesting tie-in to Temagami, because when I was a kid, we had an island in Temagami, Broom Lodge. I spent my summers there. My dad used to take our watches off and put them in the glove compartment, and he would say there's light time and there's dark time, and that's all you need to know. And so it really got me in touch with my circadian rhythms as a kid, and so I'd go back to school and I'd be up at 6. But going back up to Temagami, using maps for me has always been about finding your place in the world and sort of illustrating our sort of pedestrian experience of the world. So taking colors of architectural vernacular or of a city or the rhythms of the city and putting that into sort of aerial views. It's sort of non-traditional landscape painting. One of the things that happened when I did a residency in Bancroft, Ontario, and then later on Toronto Island for the intergenerational queer artist residency, is I started playing around with textiles. And so one of the things I like to do when I do a residency is try and find materials or things that are from those places and let that inform whatever it is that I'm making. And so when I was in Bancroft, I went to this place called Stedman's, and it had craft supplies, but it also had all of this hunting gear. And I bought a jacket thinking I would be cool. I was like, oh, I got this hunting jacket, it's really great. And they were like, James, that's a high-vis construction coat. So it just sort of made me feel on the outside, but also I'm trying. And so I found these balaclavas, and I put drag queen makeup on them and glitter and stuff. And that really opened up this door about looking at places where toxic masculinity is fostered, looking at patriarchy, and then sort of trying to tip that on its side, looking at things through a queer lens. So I'm taking a really serious topic, and I'm trying to use maybe some camp aesthetics to sort of destabilize that, or maybe suggest other ways of being. And so for this project, for Queer Up North, I did a video called Queer Unsynchronized Swim. When you think about sort of queer aesthetics or queer ways of being, often it's disruptive ways of being, or looking at the way the way somebody how do I say this? I think that there's a part of a queer way of being is to look at we'll say the regular way, or the well-accepted way, the path that is often taken, and sort of suggesting other ways of being. And I think that's one of the things that happens with queer artists, is that they have a queer sensibility and they try to do things in a different way because they've learned to do this from a very young age. And I think that, the queer sensibility creates an opportunity to ameliorate the arts, to do things something different, and something comes out of that. And so to have a whole bunch of queer people up in a very confined space in a very tight time frame, I think there's a lot that came out of that. And so I asked each participant to stand in the water, and I gave them sort of an alphabet to go through, and then I sort of cut that up. And so what you see in the video is the members sort of just being themselves, and it wasn't about synchronizing things, but also creating an equality and an equity within the frame. So each person was given sort of a square to work within. So there's a sameness that's there, but then also they got to express themselves however they wanted to. And I kind of cut that up and sped it up and put it on this sort of poppy music and made it fun. So often when we talk about or we experience marginalized people, we see their instances of trauma, like what horrible things have happened to them. And so as a counterpoint to sort of trauma-centric artwork, I wanted to make something that celebrated queerness and queer joy. And so that's sort of what I'm sort of presenting with it, with Queer Unsynchronized Swim. Like, be yourself and do it with others. It's fun.
Share your wildest art experience.
I mean, there's like the wildness, and there's like the wildness that you can like talk about, and there's the wildness that you don't want to talk about. But I mean, the wildness that was exciting, and the stuff that I really loved was seeing all the different creatures and critters scampering around. I love, foraging for rocks and things. So it was a really unique experience. It was really great.
A wild art experience that I had, I guess, talking about Wild Waysides, one of the things I believe inspired the title of the exhibition was some of the work that I was doing in Temagami, was that I would go flower picking, and they would be the wild and plants along the roadside that a lot of people consider to be weeds, or might consider to be weeds, but are really the local plants. And way back, and still today, indigenous people know about these plants and what they can do. It wasn't really a wild experience, but in the form of crazy, but it was really, really close to nature.
It was naturally
It was naturally wild. Just actually, one other wild experience was that I decided to do some work with the rocks, with myself, portrayed with a sheet of organza over myself. And underneath, I'm not dressed, and much to the surprise of the people that were driving by on the wayside, on the roadside, seeing someone standing up on the rocks with an organza sheet over their heads. So I guess that's the wild part of the Waysides.
Well, I mean, the residency was pretty wild. I mean,
That's what I want to hear.
yeah, the residency was pretty wild. There was a 6,000-year-old forest. I mean, that's older than the sequoias. Mm-hmm. That's really old. So that was pretty wild. Other things that, like, we stayed with a trapper, and he was scared about having like bears. He'd had like a couple of bear attacks. So when he was like cleaning fish or anything like that, he'd take his boat out to this rock and leave the slop of whatever on the rock. So we called it Slop Rock. That's pretty wild.
Slop Rock is pretty wild.
Slop Rock is really wild. Slop Rock.
My wildest art experience. I think, well, in the context of this piece and for this show, I actually filmed a lot at the train tracks. And while I was filming, one of the other artists, Patrick, came by on the bicycle that he was borrowing and said, "Hey, Atlas, just so you know, the train's coming." And I could hear the train horn, and I was like, "Oh, whoa!" And my camera was in the middle of the train tracks because I was shooting, and so I had to yank my camera off of the train tracks, and the train came whipping across. I was able to set up the camera and get some really cool footage of the train, which I've actually included here. But those kinds of things have happened to me so many times. Train tracks have actually been a sight in both films that I've made, so it's playing around with that little bit of sense of danger, you know.
What do you think it is about train tracks that keep you coming back to it?
I think it's the idea of mobility. So I was talking to one of my friends who came to support the show, that a train represents so many things. It represents being able to go from one place to another, but when we think of how train tracks were built, especially across Canada, we can think of the really problematic labor practices that built those train tracks for the trains to run. We also think about what is transported, like lumber and all these different resources that were extracted off of Indigenous territories that displace people. But we can also think of trains as in vagrancy, so people using trains to get from place to place. As somebody who's been a squatter, as somebody who's, you know, participated in quite a bit of vagrancy myself, it really resonates with me. It's also like industrial, but it's also sort of proto-industrial. Like we have so many other means of transportation now. I'm really fascinated by like the streetcars and trains and those kinds of elements.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I have to say, you know, I was really involved for a number of years as an artistic advisor for Louis Blanche in Toronto, which happens every year. It's an all-night-long contemporary art festival. And one year there was an installation in the parking garage below City Hall in Toronto, and it was very like dimly lit. It was a space that was kind of familiar, but also kind of mysterious and abandoned because there weren't very many cars at night. In fact, they cleared out the whole space, and there were these very large installations that, like, literally, like, you know, the size of this gallery or more, and about 10 of them. And I thought that was a really, really amazing experience.
I think this having the time to really, like, you know, I went with a couple people, like by myself, but I also went with, like, you know, Terry and David and Christian into the woods, and just like being in there and like sitting and observing and like just having that time to just be in the forest was really, you know, kind of wild in that sense. And then, but even like not wild as another thing, as being like part of the wild.
Now I'm going to ask you a leading question. I heard a little rumor that there may have been a little bit of the law.
Oh, right.
It came into things when you were up in Temagami.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about what happened with that?
Well, that's sort of interesting in relation to your other question too, with like the wild, because you know, lots of, like in Temagami, there's all those intersecting trails, and so you think you're completely alone, right? That there's nobody around. So David Fraser, whose work is over there, does pieces where, you know, he appears completely alone in, like in this case it's Temagami, and so he takes photographs of himself in the wild with like minimal clothes, and so he was in off one of the trails in this pond, body of water, had these beautiful lily pads, like he really wanted to be in the lily pads. And then, so I guess there were a couple of people going on a walk, like teenagers going on a walk, saw him, and I guess they went back and they reported that there was a naked man in the woods. He wasn't quite naked, but anyway, there was a naked man in the woods, and we had been using my car to drive around to these places, so I guess they must have taken a picture of the car. But anyway, the cops showed up at Northland Paradise Lodge, and I was just on the beach having a nice dinner, and then I went up the boat launch, like up the hill, to have dessert, to get some dessert. And you know, the sun sets in, you know, setting in the west behind where the boat launch is, and there's this looming figure at the top of the boat launch, and somebody says, "Oh, the police are here to see you." And I'm like, "What?" It's like, took me totally by surprise. And so they say, "Oh, is that your car?" And it's like, "Yeah, that's my car." And it was reported out, you know, near this pond, and the people reported there was a naked man, and so, like, you know, my brain's going, I'm like, well, we're here doing art, and it's art, and they're like, okay, it's art. So that answered their question. So they had something to go back to the people and say it was art. David came up. He was a little bit alarmed as well because it was such a surprise. It was kind of interesting because it was this ideal place, and we're like together, and we feel really safe and everything, and then there was suddenly this intrusion of like the law. And so it's a little bit of a shock to the system, but they were fine. They just left.
This was a wild art experience. I mean, I've had a few wild art experiences, but I've had a few. I've had a few wild queer experiences. I think that inform my practice. I think, I think about my own queerness. Like, I've spent time in leather bars, and I've there's things that are interesting. Like, I had a neighbor who was like talking about something that her partner was doing that she found was sort of weird. And I guess because I have this exposure to, the SM community or the leather community, and like, and I have a knowledge base of like various fetishes. There's like, everybody's going to be into their own thing. And I think, one of the things I like about queer culture, and we'll say its wildness, is its openness to sex positivity. And so often we have within straight culture, it's this like, there's all these no-nos, these like taboos that like you're not supposed to talk about, but then they do. Like there's these, homophobic guys who like want to go home and get pegged by their wife, or like there's this woman who's, living in suburbia and she's a soccer mom, but she likes to get her hair pulled. But we don't talk about that, right? Like that's not polite society. And I think that's one of the things that I like about queer culture is I can sit at a dinner table with a bunch of queer people and the topic of fisting will come up, and then you'll be talking about dinner plates. And that's something that I feel has really enriched my life, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
What is your relationship to artist-run centers like WWG, and how important is artist-run culture in the world today?
Oh, I think it's very important. I've had, right when I graduated from OCAD, I was one of the people that started Propeller Gallery, and now I'm a part of the Redhead Gallery Collective. And, we, like with Cai, who's here, and various people, like we would do like pop-up shows. So I think it's important because it gives you the freedom to experiment, and you're not bound by the, having to make something that will necessarily sell. I had, been part of commercial galleries, so I really value that as well. But I think it does allow you to, be really creative and, create interesting things and, continue on from there. I think it's super important.
Oh, it's invaluable. I have a direct connection to this gallery. So when I was in high school, I sat on a committee here. I was I think I was 17, and I think everyone here knew I was queer and I wasn't ready to come out. But I had a lot of mentors through the Whitewater Gallery, and so I volunteered here. I'm a big proponent of, or a big supporter of volunteerism. So as a young queer person, but just as a person in the arts, it's a great opportunity for young people to sort of learn how other artists work. And so volunteering and coming to a space like the Whitewater Gallery and listening to other artists talk about their work gave me the language to speak about my own practice. But also gave me an opportunity to make connections outside of this, this small town that I was in. And so it's really nice to come back and make an exhibition, particularly about queer art, queer culture, about nature, about the environment, in a space that, there might be other young people who are living here who want to see themselves represented in the artwork that is, that's exhibited. But also gives them permission to sort of unabashedly be themselves and go out in the world and make their own work.
Perfect. Thank you, James.
Thanks, babe.
So there you have it, the wild world of Wild Waysides. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Hyper Creative. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit that like button, press that notification bell, subscribe to our YouTube channel because we've got more coming up, so stay tuned.